that's life-changing, because when you start to notice what you want and learn how to ask for it, it immediately leaves the bedroom and it enters into all aspects of your life, including your community life, your civil life, your international politics life. I mean, taking responsibility for what you want, I've come to see, is an inherent human capacity that is necessary and changes our lives.
Welcome to the Given Consent podcast. My goal is to introduce you to the people and ideas behind sex positivity. Today, I'm joined by Betty Martin. Welcome.
I feel really honored to be here on your first show.
On my first show. So hopefully everything works right. I'm excited to be speaking with you today because you're one of those people whose name comes up in conversations over and over again. Whenever we're teaching consent and boundaries, they're like, oh, if you really want to be effective at this, you should look at the work of Betty Martin. And as I've researched you, I found out that you train practitioners, you offer therapy to individuals, you're a certified sexological body worker, and I do want to dive into all that. But let's start with just kind of defining consent for our audience, because I feel like it's one of those things that is, for some reason, very confusing for people.
That's a great question, and it's a great place to start. The dictionary defines consent as essentially you agreeing to what somebody else wants. So it means you agree to let them do what they want to do, or you agree to do what they want you to do. And so when you hear people say, give consent or get consent, that's what they're talking about. I can get consent to do the thing that I want to do to you, or I can give you consent to do the thing that you want to do to me. However, I like to expand the definition. I use it more to mean agreement. What's the agreement that we have together? So it's not give consent or get consent, because that means it's something that the other person wants. It's arrive at consent together. And really a more accurate word would be agreement, but consent is kind of the word of the decade, so we'll use consent. But I think that's one reason why it's confusing. And so a lot of people will think consent means permission, and that's one kind of consent, but it's not the only kind of consent, and I think that's where it gets confusing. So if I want to reach over and run my hands through your hair, I need your permission, because it's something that I want to do. But if I ask you to run your hands through my hair, then permission doesn't fit that dynamic. I don't know of a word that fits that dynamic. But I think that's one reason why it gets confusing, because if you think of it as permission, it means I want to do this thing and you're giving me permission to do it, and that's consent. And that's true, it is consent. But it's not the only kind of consent. Yeah. If I'm asking you to do something, consent applies, but permission does not apply to that situation. Also, I think it can be confusing because we're taught that yes means yes, no means no, and silence is not a yes, silence is a no, which is really basic and very important. And in reality, we use lots of ways to convey yes or no. We use body language, we use facial expression. We say things like, oh, not tonight, honey, or nah, I'm not so much into that, or nah, how about this instead? We don't actually come out with the word no, which is perfectly natural. I mean, it's not a problem. But it means that if we think consent means yes, and no means no, it's in reality, it's a lot more nuanced than that. So that can be confusing for people. But essentially, yeah, there's essentially two ways to ask for what you want. It's will you and may I. And this is what the wheel of consent is built on. Will you do XYZ for me or to me? And may I do XYZ to you? And that's pretty much, it's going to fall in pretty much one of those two camps.
Nice, thank you. I that's always like a hard thing to try to explain to people. I'm like, it's a little bit nuanced. It's a little bit something I feel like you learn to be better about with time.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
how'd you get into this exactly? Like, how'd you end up here?
Oh boy, that's a good. How long you got? I was I was in my mid-40s, 3 kids, divorced, and I realized that my sexuality was not what it could be. I was reasonably functional, but there's more. It's got to be more. And I took a workshop with the Body Electric School for women in sexuality, and and I had so many ahas there that it opened the door for me to just take on this path for quite a number of years. And one of the ahas there was that my eroticism belongs to me. And it was such a big aha that it made me wonder, well, who did I think it belonged to all these years? And I realized that as a person growing up in the 1950s, a woman growing up in the 1950s, I thought that my eros was always in response to somebody else's interest or desire. And I was so steeped in it that I didn't even notice that that's what I thought until I had this series of experiences that showed me that, oh no, it's mine. It's mine. It comes from me. It arises in me. I can use it. I can bring it out to play if and when and how I choose and with whom I choose. And it was a big revelation for me. And a handful of friends and I met together for 2 or 3 years exploring what we'd learned in the workshop and going on from there, and took some other workshops with them and over the years, and really dove into, okay, what is eros anyway? And like, what is this body that I'm in, and what is it capable of, and how does it feel, and what is it that's about me? And it helped me to separate my experience from the kind of, with sex or relationship or intimacy, there's another person in the room generally, and it's about the relationship, and, you're interacting, and that's lovely. And there's something different to be gained by having the experiences that are all about you. So, for example, my 4 or 5 friends, we would take turns on the massage table and have experiences that were just completely mind-blowing, that were about touch and pleasure and orgasm and just mind-blowing. And it showed me that I was capable of experiences in my body that I had no idea I was capable of, that I would never have gotten to with a partner, because of necessity, you're kind of attending to your partner's experience as well as your own. And being able to attend just to my experience was astounding for me. And I think it is for most people. I mean, you'll discover different things than I did. You'll discover what you discovered, but having experiences that are all about you, and the reason you can go there is because you have an agreement. You have the consent. You have a container of, okay, this 20 minutes is all about me, and the next 20 minutes is all about you, for example.
I want to clarify something on, we were just talking about massage, and it reminds me of something we do through Sex Positive with Massage à Trois, which is to say it's a space where you can kind of play with erotic energy, but it's not
Mm-hmm.
about a traditional kind of sex like people would think of it. Like it's not about orgasm,
Absolutely.
it's not about trying to arrive somewhere or penetration. Am I right in
Yes.
thinking that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just wanted
Yeah.
to make sure we said
Yeah.
that too.
Yeah. Yeah. And learning to play with, as you call it, erotic energy, or playing with your own arousal. Well, you discover all kind of things about yourself that you might not have known. And I feel very lucky to have had that opportunity for a number of years. Um, and it really kind of became a spiritual path for me to follow this. Like, how does this work? Who am I? What am I capable of? What is this feeling? What is this energy in me? And um, so after a few years of that, I realized that I wanted to offer those experiences to other people who did not have my background. I, at that time, was working as a chiropractor on a small island outside of Seattle. And about that time, I moved into Seattle and closed my chiropractic office and opened a new studio doing sex work. And at first, it was pretty clinical. I mean, when I say sex work, I'm defining sex very broadly. Um, we were clothed. I was taking people into experiences of their noticing what their sensation was and how to notice what they wanted, and I learned pretty quickly that most people had no clue of what they wanted or how they wanted to be touched, or really, that was a big aha for me. Um, so I did that work for a few years, and um, and then took and then I realized at one point, okay, I'm ready to offer more specifically sexual activity for people that I feel safe with and comfortable with, and for whom it seems useful, because it's not useful for everyone. And so, which essentially means, okay, I'm ready to take some of my clothes off, besides the clients maybe taking theirs off for a massage, for example. And and I knew, well, I need to charge more for that. So I set up a new website and a new name, and a new payment schedule. So for a long time, I had two practices. I had one practice as Betty Martin that was clothed and kind of therapeutic in nature. And I had another practice as Beth Morgan, which was sexier. But even so, both of them, both of both of me's were working with people to help them learn what they wanted, how to ask for what they want, how to experience pleasure, how to enjoy their skin. It's really basic stuff. And most of what you need to learn if you want to have better sex is learned before you ever take your clothes off. So, clothes off was not a given. It happens sometimes, but certainly not all the time. So that's what that practice is called, or was called, a sacred intimate practice. And I did have a little bit of training for that with the Body Electric School, but mostly it was based on years and years, decades that I had done peer counseling and just learned how to pay really good attention to people. And then I went and took the sexological body work class after I'd already been working for a number of years. And it was developed and based on what I had already learned in Body Electric School workshops developed by the same person. So it wasn't anything new for me because I'd already been doing it, but it was a useful certificate to hang on the wall. and it's a wonderful profession. It's very strictly one-way touch, and the practitioner is always closed. And so it's very much about the receiver's experience. It's not interactive. But I was doing interactive work, so I didn't really use that modality so very much. And then later I got certified as a surrogate partner, which is specifically interactive. And as surrogacy, you work in a triad. So there's you, there's the client, and there's the client's therapist. And all three of you are talking, and the therapist is guiding and making suggestions about what you do. And so that's really also a really great model. But most of the time I was just working on my own and having a great time. I just loved that work. I'm not doing it much anymore, but I really enjoyed it. Seeing people's ahas, and you were asking this earlier about how it affected people's lives. And I'm very happy to say that discovering my own erotic empowerment completely changed my life. And I think that working with clients, they also had experiences that changed their lives. And I think a big part of it is learning to notice what you feel, what your body sensation is, whether it's, I feel goosebumps here, I feel heat here, I feel scared, I feel excited, whatever it is. Noticing what you desire and speaking up for what you desire. That's life-changing, because when you start to notice what you want and learn how to ask for it, it immediately leaves the bedroom and it enters into all aspects of your life, including your community life, your civil life, your international politics life. I mean, taking responsibility for what you want, I've come to see, is an inherent human capacity that is necessary and changes our lives. I think that's probably the biggest thing that I'm aware of, as well as people learning how to enjoy themselves, how to relax, how to notice that they have a boundary or limit, and notice how to say that, and which helps them relax. And so it was just a lot of fun, the sacred intimate work. Yeah, very satisfying seeing people's ahas, especially over time. And I had people that I saw for maybe a few years, and seeing them grow was really satisfying.
Yeah, you just encapsulated so much of the sex positive journey, talking about just that. I think it's absolutely healing for people to be able to share touch that does not have to be with a romantic partner. Like, that was so
Oh,
eye-opening,
yes.
being able to touch people and be close and then say goodbye and go
Yeah.
home, and there's nothing extra.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah. How do you
Yeah.
see that kind of like show up for people? Like, what's kind of like the transformation or the healing that goes on? Because I think that this really breaks down to more than just like it feels good. I see people really, their whole demeanors change and other things change about their life.
Well, I think I kind of touched on it before. Human desire, which I'm defining very broadly, not just sexual desire, but desire for a walk in the woods, a desire for the river that runs by your house to run clean instead of polluted. Um, Human desire is what drives the world, and it determines which way the world drives. I remember hearing an environmental activist in an interview on Democracy Now! One time saying, well, who's saying, well, part of the reason we're having trouble is because we don't know what we want. She said, I know what I want. I want less dioxin in every mother's breast milk next year, and I want more salmon in the river, and I want more songbirds. And I thought, yeah, that is what comes from knowing what you want. And to the degree that we shut that capacity down, which we all do to varying degrees, largely because it's sort of drummed out of us as children, to the degree that we shut that down, we can't go out and clean up our rivers because we don't know that we want that. We don't know how to want. And that's really empowerment.
Yeah.
That's a big part of empowerment. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Yeah, I love that. Um, so let's talk a little bit about consent, because your whole thing is the wheel of consent is what your new book is talking about also.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about giving, receiving, taking, and allowing, and then doing and done to. So
Mm-hmm.
like kind of when did you realize that you could break it down like that? And
Mm-hmm.
what does it really mean?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, one of those many workshops I went to in those exploratory years was, again, it was the Body Electric School, and it was a workshop called Power, Surrender, and Intimacy, which was about using BDSM approaches as kind of a self-awareness journey. Great workshop. I did it several times. And one of the games that we played in there was called the 3-minute game. And it's just two people ask each other these two questions. Question one is, what do you want me to do to you? And question two is, what do you want to do to me? Really simple. You just take turns. And with two people taking 2 turns, you're going to end up with 4 rounds. And that game was invented by Harry Faddis, and is taught lots of different places now. But it was so fun in the workshops, like, what do you want to do to me for 3 minutes? Oh, hell yeah, I can think of some fun things to do to you for 3 minutes, you know? And so I took it home, and I wasn't seeing clients yet, but I just kind of put it on the shelf. And when I started seeing clients a year or 2 later, I took it off the shelf, dusted it off, and I brought it out, and I thought, well, this would be a good way to transition from the talking, history-taking part of the session into the touching part of the session. And it'll show me, you know, what's this person's current skill level and comfort level with touch. And so I brought it out, used with clients, and I pretty soon learned that the question was too broad. So I changed it to, how do you want me to touch you, and how do you want to touch me? Because I was teaching that more than the other. So, so you ask people how they want to be touched, and most people will kind of struggle with that question. And it's totally natural to struggle with that question, because who's ever asked you that before? A lot of people would say, well, I don't know, you're the expert, you decide. Or, oh, anything you want to do is okay with me. Or, well, you can X, Y, Z, which is true, I can, but that's not the question. I asked what you wanted. So, so that asking people that question taught me a lot about where we all get lost. It's really for us, but we forget that, and we act like it's for the other person's benefit. And I see you nodding your head like,
well, I'm
yeah.
thinking this is one of those things
and
where
this,
people hear it and they go, yeah, that'd be really cool. But the thing is, you have to now, after you've seen this video, go try it with somebody, a friend or a partner, because
yeah,
hearing it is not the same
yeah,
thing as doing it. When you're put on the spot and you're like, how do I want to be touched right
yeah,
now?
yeah,
It'd be nice
yeah.
if, and you see people freeze. Or sometimes,
Yeah,
people are
yeah,
just like, it just thinking it through is overwhelming.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And it's completely understandable because we're, from our earliest days, before we can talk, we're touched in all kinds of ways that we don't want or we don't like, and we get used to it. And we just kind of learn that touch is this thing that happens to us, whether we like it or not, and we have to figure out how to be okay with it, and we don't really get a choice about it. And, you know, so it's plus it's vulnerable. Asking for what we want is inherently vulnerable. It's not because there's something wrong with us. It's inherent. So, I'm going to ask you to stroke my head in a certain way is like, yeah, it's just too scary. So it's completely understandable that it's hard for people. And asking that question to hundreds of clients taught me that, oh, yeah, this is really hard for people. This is where people get lost. And then you see where it is in yourself. You see, oh, well, this is where I get lost with the same question too. So that's one dynamic. I'm asking you what you want me to do to you, and then you're saying, well, will you scratch my back? And I say yes or no, or I can do that in this way if that works for you. Mm-hmm. So that's one dynamic. Then the other dynamic, the other question is, how do you want to touch me? And then people really get confused because they'll say, well, however you want. And I'd say, well, that could be nice, but that wasn't the question. It's what do you want? How do you want to touch me that's for your enjoyment? And for a lot of people, they just can't grok that because we have welded the idea of doing touch to the idea of giving. Like if I'm touching you, its definition is supposed to be for you. And that's lovely. It can be lovely. But there's something missing that is recovered when you learn how to touch someone for your pleasure, not for their pleasure. And that's difficult for most people. And for a lot of people, just make your eyes cross and you can't figure out what the heck we're talking about. And so I'd say go watch the videos on my website. There's 7 or 8 hours of free videos on there at bettymartin.org and help yourself. But that's the other dynamic. I'm doing to you what I want to do with your permission. And you get to say, you can do this part, but not this part, or you can do that, but not too deep, or you can do that, but not too slow, or whatever. Because your boundaries matter, of course. So now you've got two dynamics. I'm doing what you want me to do, or I'm doing what I want to do. And then the reverse, you're doing what I want you to do, or you're doing what you want to do. And that creates four quadrants. You have but again, this is on the website. You can download a copy of it, but it creates two axes. One is who's doing, and the other is who it's for. So the Wheel of Consent grew out of the 3-minute game. And it is really a diagram of what happens when two people play the 3-minute game. That's really all it is. And then you start playing with it, you start realizing, oh, this applies to a lot more than touch. Yeah. This applies to a lot of things, and it applies to the world. But I learned it through touch, and I mostly teach it through touch. And although now with having to teach everything online, we are learning different ways to teach it.
So you just mentioned on your website that you have all these great videos walking us through the Wheel of Consent, but you've also just released a book that's on more topics within the Wheel of Consent. It's all on giving and receiving. So what's in the book?
The book is basically a how-to. The book tells a little bit of the story that I just told you. And as a how-to, it gives you lessons and labs on how to find each of those 4 quadrants. And the reason that it does take some explaining, because they tend to be counterintuitive. And I've helped enough people through it in person, hundreds, probably over 1,000 people in person. So I know where people are going to get lost. I've seen it and I've seen it. So, and it's totally normal and natural to get lost. So the lessons and labs in there are walk you through the steps that it takes for it to click. And when it clicks, when your hands get it, you get it. It's a somatic experience.
What do you mean by somatic experience? Because I want to make sure we don't lose anyone.
Somatic means in the body. Yeah, it's a felt sense. Your hands get it, and you go, oh my gosh, that makes perfect sense now, because it just feels different. And then I go into the theory of explaining the wheel and kind of what each quadrant, what's challenging, what's liberating about it, what it has to do with the world, and stuff like that. So it's called The Art of Receiving and Giving, the Wheel of Consent. And it'll be out, I think, in November. We're back and forth with the publisher.
Excellent. But that's great, though, because it's an actual practical guide. Because I feel like when it comes to consent and setting boundaries, and for anyone who's listening, anytime I bring up boundaries, somebody says, I'm terrible at that. It comes to getting in a space where you're practicing saying yes and no to people, where you start to think about answers to those questions you are giving. So I think that's great that it's something you can actually use like a workbook instead of just read about and go, okay, I get it, and you move on with your life.
Yeah. No. No. As far as I can tell, consent and empowerment is a lifelong journey and a lifelong practice, because I've been delving deeply into it for 15 years, and I'm still not good at it. Like, I have places where I step over my own boundaries and where I step over other people's boundaries, and so it's a lifelong practice. And the wheel of consent is actually a practice too, because it's so simple and is it's kind of like a distilled version of learning consent, because you're asking, may I, will you? When I ask you, how do you want to touch me? You're going to say, well, I want to do blah, blah, blah. May I do that? And so you're learning to say, may I and will you? You're learning to say yes and no, and under these conditions and for this long. And so it's a practice game in exquisite consent, and very, very simple, which is why it's so challenging, because there's nothing to hide behind. You can't hide behind the other person's desire or the other person's pleasure or the other person's moans and groans, because you're choosing what you want. And so it's a practice.
So speaking of practice, we're right now in a time where we're very isolated from each other because there's a worldwide pandemic. And even though we are starting to come out of our homes, the idea of getting together with a bunch of people and cuddling is not on the table. So what advice do you have for our listeners in terms of actually staying connected and just kind of staying healthy in that connected kind of way?
I don't have any medical or healthcare or pandemic advice, but I do, and I feel for you. It's hard not being in opportunities where you can touch another person. And there are many people who were already in that position. Because like you said, if you can't separate touch and sex, then you're not going to get much touch either. So there are many, many people who weren't getting any touch to begin with. So yeah, there's that. And but you can experience some connection over Zoom with eye contact, with listening, with dancing together. I joined a group that every day at 1 o'clock we all log on to Zoom and dance, and for 15 minutes. It's really great. And so there's connection and there's touch, two different things and two different needs, I think. And we can definitely meet our need for connection over Zoom or sitting across the lawn from somebody in a park. Touch is harder, of course. And touch, to some degree, we can meet ourselves by, massaging our arms, scratching our heads, getting in a hot bath, those kind of things. But it's not the same. It's not the same.
Absolutely. I think that's really great, though, to touch on staying connected with people, because it's very easy to take the isolation and kind of just roll with that into a worse state.
I want to go back to something you said about touch and sex and platonic touch, which I think is really important and really brilliant that you said. I also facilitate cuddle parties sometimes, and I'm part of that organization, and that's also a lot of fun. And what really, I learned this as a hippie, that touch is not always about sex, because we have big puppy piles, and it's great. But what I've noticed is that most people conflate the two, and until you can tell them apart, you can't enjoy any touch that isn't about sex, because you don't really know that it exists. And so when touch is in the room, you think sex is in the room. And it's a terrible loss, because our need for touch is a different need than our need for sexual expression. And learning to have the only way that you can learn to tell them apart is by having experiences in which they are apart. So having experiences of cuddles and puppy piles that are not about sex, then you find out, oh my gosh, this is totally amazing. This is totally different than sex. Why? This is a whole different thing. And that's hard to imagine until you have that experience. So yeah, I wanted to say something about sexual expression. This comes from Marcia Rosenberg with Nonviolent Communication, and he defines a list of human needs, food and air and water and exercise and expression and, all kinds of social needs and stuff. And he explains that sexual expression is a need. Sex as an activity is not a human need. You can go your whole life without sexual activity, or certainly without sexual intercourse, and you're fine. But sexual expression means expressing who you are as a sexual being that's true to you, as opposed to what you think you're supposed to do, or supposed to like, or supposed to want, or supposed to be okay with, or who you think you're supposed to be as a sexual being. That the actual need is basically to be true to who you are as a sexual being. It's not to engage in activity X, Y, or Z. And so I think that's just helpful to know.
Yeah, I think that's helpful too, because a lot of people associate being sex positive or touch positive or into BDSM, meaning that they're dirty or something's wrong with them, when it is actually very puritanical to think that you can't have the touch because there must be the sex with it, and that's bad.
Yeah.
And that was a big leap for me on my
Exactly.
journey to realize that I could have that.
I think that's what sex positive really is all about, isn't it? Taking the sex is
Yes.
bad and awful into a new paradigm which says, no, actually, it's
Yeah.
pretty cool. And there are ways to explore it that are meaningful to you and that don't harm anyone else. And you will find some really interesting things about yourself that way.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. Where can people find you?
BettyMartin.org. I'm also on YouTube, and there's, like I said, there's a bunch of free videos on that website.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining me today for my first podcast. For anyone who's listening, please comment on this. Let me know you're listening. Let me know if this worked for you, and be gentle because I'm new. So, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you want to see more, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so that we end up in your feed. If you got something out of this personally that was helpful to you, also please leave a comment below. I love hearing the feedback about what's working and what's not. That's what makes this show better. And until next time, love you more, and we'll see you then.